So, like I said, today I'm going to, of course, be getting into talking more about the Roman Empire, mostly the first century, and maybe if I can, the second century as well. I'll also talk about the rise of Christianity as well. By the way, if anybody is on Facebook or YouTube, you can join me right now. There, of course, is the link to StreamYard.com. If you want to come in, plenty of room right now. You want to watch the, of course, live stream of this lecture, or you can also watch it later when I do upload the video, of course, to my YouTube channel. So send me any questions you have or comments later you have about the lecture overall. Right, so from last time, I believe where I was at this point, we were talking about the early Roman emperors. I think I had gotten into, and I talked about the so-called Julio-Claudian dynasty, they dub it. So I've talked about Augustus and Tiberius already, the first two. I haven't talked about the other three, so I'm going to talk about that today. I'll also get into like the rise of Christianity, because that starts also at the same time as well. I'll talk about the Flavian dynasty, and if I have any time after that, I'll get into maybe talking about the second century, the peak of the Pax Romana, and all that. So I think we were up to the point where Tiberius died around 37, which the Romans were kind of happy about because he was kind of tyrannical. And then, of course, we also had gotten into as well talking, I believe we had talked about Nero getting in as well. I think we talked about him, Nero, which I think he came in next. Caligula, of course. No, not Nero, Caligula. I'm sorry. Caligula came in. I think I told you Caligula was the great-grandson of Augustus, and he was also the nephew of Tiberius. So he comes in next and takes over as emperor. So that's what we're going to talk about, of course, a little bit, of course, about him. And I'll talk about also Claudius, and then I'll get into also Emperor Nero as well. Now, I think I'd already kind of went into, I thought I kind of covered a little bit on Caligula. He was very popular for about 6 months. I think I talked about this previously. Reigned from 37 to 41 CE, and apparently he had some kind of illness after about 6 months, which there's kind of a debate about what happened to Caligula. I think there's one claim that he may have suffered from encephalitis, which is like a swelling in the brain. So he went into a coma for a couple months or whatever. He came out of it, and next thing you know, he, of course, comes out of the coma and starts going insane, which, Caligula's kind of known for. And so he becomes a sadistic ruler, kind of like a megalomaniac kind of figure. The name Caligula is not his real name. His full name, if you want to know, is, I'll give you the full name they called him, but his real name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. Of course, I've got the short name. And he was, by the way, the son of Germanicus, who was a famous Roman general. The guy, by the way, that found the remains of the Teutoburg Forest legions that were wiped out, which you've probably seen the video. That was his father that found them. And I think they say his father was going to be emperor, but he died mysteriously at a very young age. Some people think he may have been poisoned by Tiberius, but they never proved it. But Caligula, who was a boy at the time under his father, was called Caligula, which meant little boots, because he was seen as a mascot for basically them. Anyway, so that's how he got his name, but he hated the name, and he preferred to be called Gaius Julius Caesar, by the way. So that's where he got the name. Now, eventually he started like going crazy and doing all kinds of crazy antics, which is very true about him. There's all kinds of stories about him, which they're not sure are true or not. But there's one story about his sister I wanted to talk about. His name was Drusilla, and apparently he had slept with her a few times. At least they believe the story. They think that after she died, like young, he became very depressed. And that may have been part of what may have caused him to go crazy or something like that. He also had this racehorse he had that they always talked about named Incitatus. And he used it like in chariot races and in the Circus Maximus. Anyway, he threatened one time to make his horse Roman consul. He didn't think anybody else could do the position or whatever. So it's a lot of bizarre stories about Caligula. There's even a story where he opened a brothel in the palace because he had spent a lot of the Roman treasury, and he made a lot of the senators' wives act as prostitutes. Now these stories are kind of crazy, but I'm not sure if they're true or not. Because writers like Suetonius are kind of romanticizing a lot of the things that happened under these emperors. He is eventually murdered. So Caligula is believed to be the first Roman emperor that was actually murdered. He was killed by the Praetorian Guard, including, by the way, his whole family. They were wiped out. And so his uncle took power, of course, which is Claudius. Claudius came in, and Claudius was actually found in the actual palace. He was hiding because he thought they were going to kill him too, the Praetorian Guard. And they found him hiding, I think, in a balcony behind some curtains. They pulled him out and said, "Hey, you're emperor now." And you can see a very famous painting there where he's basically begging for his life. "Don't kill me, don't kill me." "Oh, you're emperor, by the way." So that's kind of basically how, Claudius came in and, of course, became emperor. Now, a little bit about Claudius. He's often called Claudius the First because there was later an emperor named Claudius the Second. So a second Claudius that ruled later. So they usually call him either one, Claudius or Claudius the First. He did have a nicknames he was often called the Cripple or the Lame because he walked with a limp, and he had some kind of old war wound that he had from, I think he was a general at one point, going back to the time of Tiberius. Anyway, he basically is considered to be one of the best of the 5 Julio-Claudian emperors. So he's like the second best emperor behind really Augustus overall, because the other 3 aren't very good, which are, of course, are Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero. They were kind of tyrants, more or less. And he's actually one of the first emperors you can see there to be born outside of Italy. Most the emperors before that had all been born in Italy. And so Claudius was actually one of the first to be born in Gaul, where France is. Also in about the year, I believe it's 43 CE, Claudius is the one that started the conquest of Britain, which is true. He started doing that, where the Romans started crossing the English Channel and trying to take over where England is today. It would take something like 40-something years for the Romans to eventually conquer it. Under Julius Agricola, later on, they would conquer most of England up to around where the Scottish border is. A little bit, I think, above that as well at one point as a whole. And the Romans called Roman Britain, they actually called it Britannica. Actually not Britannica, Britannia. Yeah, Britannia. That's what they called it. Yeah, Britannia. Claudius was also married 4 times, and his 4th wife, if you know about it, conspired against him to overthrow his throne. And her name was Agrippina the Younger, or Agrippina Minor, they called her. And she had a son who was basically a grandnephew of Claudius, who was named Nero. And she helped Nero basically get on the throne by poisoning Claudius. So Claudius was actually poisoned, they think, as far as they know. At least that's the theory they have about it, what happened to Claudius. And he was eventually killed. So that's how the last emperor came in, of course, which is Emperor Nero would eventually seize power, which will be in the year 54, they think. And he was very young. Nero was 16 when he came to power, 16 years old. One of the youngest emperors, I think, so far at that point. And they think that, I'll get to that. Of course, the thing that he's most notorious for, we'll get to, of course, is the Great Fire of Rome. They think he may have been blamed for it or may have been behind it more or less. I'll get to that later. But he reigned about 14 years. Like I said, he was the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. They only had 5 of them, basically. Like I said, he was a grandnephew of Claudius the First when he comes in. And they think he was kind of tyrannical, kind of like Tiberius was, and kind of like maybe even crazy or mad like Caligula was. And he was also known for a lot of debauchery, which is true about that. Caligula was too, if you know about that. And he was known for like having multiple lovers and mistresses. He was also bisexual. He liked men a lot and stuff like that. And Nero was famous for supposedly going out, and he would disguise himself and go out and like visit the brothels and get drunk. And there's even stories where he would actually dress up in disguise and go out and mug people. The guy was crazy. And he also was a musician. You know about this. He would give like presentations where he would perform playing the lyre, the stringed instrument, and sing songs. And he thought he was a great artist, and stuff like that. He was notorious for killing his mother, Agrippina the Younger, who was, they think, the power behind the throne. There are rumors that he may have slept with his mother. I don't know if that's true or not. They might be made up about that one. But he killed her. He had her killed, basically, to solidify his power. So it's probably right about when he was like close to about maybe 20 years old. He pretty much had full power, over the state at that point. Then later in his reign, as you know, close to 64 CE, they had the Great Fire of Rome, which they think really was likely an accident. That, like I said, started in the Circus Maximus and then spread to most of the city. Most of the city burned, except for 4 districts that weren't damaged. It was considered one of the worst natural catastrophes, one of the worst catastrophes that happened, of course, in Rome, which is not the only fire. They've had like several fires. I think there was one under Domitian. They had one also under Commodus as well that occurred. They think it caused hundreds of deaths. I don't know if they know the exact number, but they definitely think it killed hundreds of people. And a lot of people, of course, were made homeless because of the fire. He did get blamed. Some of the historians later blamed him for the fire. They thought he may have been behind it. I think Suetonius, was one of the, Suetonius and Cassius Dio, or Dio Cassius, they called him, blamed him for the fire. They actually mentioned they think he may have been behind it. Then Tacitus, the other writer, says he didn't do it. It depends on which one you read about. But they do think that apparently what happened, why people thought this, was because he took part of the slum of like the slum areas where they had been burned out. He started building like a lavish palace for himself. And so a lot of the people thought maybe that he was behind it. In fact, where it is right here, here it is right here, so-called Golden House, they called it, which was one of Emperor Nero's famous palaces that he would build. He would actually built it on the burnt out areas there. It had a gold roof on it, which is why it was called the Golden House. And so that's why people thought maybe he was behind it and all of that. So Nero, realizing that he's getting all this, criticism, about the fire and all of that, he decided to blame somebody else. And so you know what he did? He blamed the Christians for it. They started the fire. I didn't do it. And so he went on to become, of course, the first emperor that would openly persecute the Christians, which were becoming this new religious sect related back to, Jesus Christ of course, back in Israel. And so a lot of historians start talking about this. Like you read about Tacitus and mostly Suetonius, both those authors mention about how Nero started persecuting them. They also actually describe how they were put to death. Like some were crucified. There were some cases where some early Christians were burned they were burned. They were actually crucified and then burned or something like that, set on fire. There was even a case where they were thrown to like wild animals and things like that. So that all is just kind of starts under his reign, and then it kind of continues under other emperors later that also, don't like Christians as well. Then, of course, what happened was due to that and his, unpopularity and his, tyranny under his reign, his armies all under him rebelled, is what occurred. So a lot of his generals started rebelling. A lot of his generals, even in cases where they started claiming that they're the emperor instead of him. And so the armies start fighting for control over the throne. And at one point, the Senate even declares himself the actual, like an actual outlaw. And so they try to hunt him down, but before they could capture him, he committed suicide, is what happened to eventually Nero. So that was the end of Nero. He's pretty much dead at that point. And so I'm going to, of course, move on, of course, next. We need, of course, talking about, how Nero, started persecuting the Christians and all that. I need to get into and go back and talk about, the rise of Christianity, which that does start, if you think about it, under Emperor Tiberius. He was, basically the emperor when they think it kind of started, although really under Augustus is when they think that Jesus was born originally. They do think it started in the eastern part of the empire where Israel is today, which Israel at the time was actually occupied by the Romans. They had two provinces they controlled, which was Judea, where Jerusalem is today, and then Galilee, which is up in the northern part of Israel. And most of early Christianity, of course, is based on the life and teachings and stories about Jesus of Nazareth, of course, which are in the New Testament today, like in the gospel accounts and all of that. And Jesus was believed to be some kind of preacher who was a Jewish rabbi, I guess they would call it now, although he was actually a carpenter by trade, if you know about that. He was from Galilee, a small town called Nazareth, which you've heard of. And of course, a lot of Christians later think that Jesus was the Son of God and also the Christian Messiah that's mentioned in the Old Testament. And so basically that's, what a lot of Christians believe about Jesus. And we'll get to it later about the gospel accounts. They're not written down at this point. I think it's believed that a lot of the stories about Jesus were originally oral in tradition. Then over time, they start writing down in Greek by the end of the first and into the second centuries CE or AD. So obviously, like I said, based on the New Testament, especially the books of the gospel accounts of Matthew and Luke. Those are the two main ones which go into a lot of the early life of Jesus, like his virgin birth, talking about his mother Mary, and later his father Joseph as well. So all that's kind of considered in those two books the most. Although a lot of his early life is not known much. That's one thing about Jesus, especially between the period, I think, when he's first born and all of that, and like later his ministry, there's not much known, which is true about that. The birth date of Jesus is kind of debated. I think they seem to think it's anywhere from like 6 AD or CE to like 4 BC. So that's about the date of it. And so they tend to round it off, if you know about that, to like 1 CE or 1 AD, which is what they used to say, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. And then later, the whole birth date, December 25th, is something they add later. I don't know if they really know what day it is when Jesus was born. Some claim it was even in the spring and not the winter, that kind of thing. But the whole birth date is something they add later in Christianity. Like I said, there's very little information about his life, maybe up until the time when, John the Baptist baptized him in the River Jordan, that kind of thing. We don't really know much about, the early life of Jesus, but we know more like about his ministry and all his followers that were, under him. They seem to think his ministry was only about 3 years, or about 30 to 33 CE. That's the popular date. 33 CE is the popular date of when Jesus was crucified and put to death. At least that's the popular date. But that's still debated too as well about the different dates. So all this happened under Emperor Tiberius. So in the Bible, when they're talking about Caesar, that's who they're talking about. They're talking about Tiberius at the time. Now, Jesus, they think in 33 CE was arrested at the Last Supper. What happened was the reason why he was put to death was because he was accused of blasphemy. He was kind of seen as, being the Son of God, which some people thought he wasn't. And so he was put on trial by two different different groups. The Jews and then, of course, the Romans had their own separate trials, and kind of went back and forth between them, like who should charge him and all that, and punish him. And eventually, the Roman prefect, if you know about this, who was under Tiberius, named Pontius Pilate, was the one that decided the fate of Jesus, who actually thought Jesus was innocent, by the way, and eventually put him to death. He was crucified in 33 CE. And of course, the date today is now, when he was crucified, is now what they call Good Friday. Then later, of course, Christians believe he resurrected on what we now call, Easter Sunday. Of course, Jesus had a lot of disciples. You study about Jesus. They were later called the apostles, or 12 apostles. These were the main followers of Jesus that were real important overall. And some you may have heard of, like Peter, John, James the Greater, James the Lesser, Matthew, Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Simon, Thomas, Thaddeus, and of course Judas, you've probably heard of, who betrayed Jesus and all of that. And the ones that were, I guess, the most important ones that were under him, I'll get to later. Probably Peter, St. Peter, or Simon Peter. I'll get to him later. But he was considered one of the most important leaders that was under Jesus, who would help try to spread the religion of Christianity. And that's what happened. Suppose there was a case where Jesus resurrected and he went and talked to him, the so-called Great Commission, they dubbed it. And he told basically his disciples, the apostles, to spread Christianity throughout the empire. And so starting in 33 CE, they think that started a new period with early Christianity that was called the Apostolic Age, which would go from, around, they think, the crucifixion of Jesus to about close to the end of the first century, close to 100 CE, because they think that's when I think it's John the Apostle. Yeah, John the Apostle would eventually, die. I think about that time, they believe. And so throughout that period, you have this case where all these different followers of Christianity start spreading it east to west, across the empire overall. These were famous apostles of Jesus that were well known. St. Peter, of course, or Peter, usually Simon Peter, they called him, which Peter meant the rock, about this. And he was considered one of the first big leaders under Jesus. And after later, he would, go on to be considered the so-called first bishop of Rome. Also, they call the first pope, about that. St. John the Baptist, of course, another one that was a pretty big figure who's important. Of course, he was very known for, of course, writing they think he's the one attributed to the Gospel of John. They think the epistles of John. And also, they think that John the Baptist may have been the one that also wrote the book of Revelation, as far as they know. St. James the Greater, of course, was one of the other St. James. Like St. James Parish, like in Louisiana, is named after him, I believe. That's correct. And he was called the Greater, and he's important. St. James, he helped spread Christianity to the West, especially all the way like Spain at one point, they think. Also, they had St. James the Lesser as well. But John the Baptist and James the Greater were brothers. Then, of course, later there's Paul of Tarsus, also called St. Paul, that you know of. He becomes eventually, in the first century, the most famous of the different apostles. He didn't really know Jesus, by the way, St. Paul, but Paul was originally named Saul. He was actually a Jew that converted to Christianity. He actually had persecuted Christians first. And what happened was Paul started going throughout the empire because he was a citizen. He could travel everywhere. And he began converting like all the different Roman pagans to Christianity. And so I think he was often called the apostle to the Gentiles, was one of his nicknames. And so they think Paul was one of the most influential of the apostles eventually. He influenced more than anything than compared to some of the other ones overall. Of course, the gospel accounts, like I said, were originally written down, which were like stories about Jesus, his life, his birth, his death, and all that, and resurrection. And the name gospel means good news in Greek, is what it means. They think it was originally oral. There's a debate about what language it was written in originally. Some people think maybe Hebrew, possibly, or Aramaic. Some of them may have been written in, but over time they were written in Greek. You know about that. And those are the four main ones, of course, that they eventually would canonize, like in the Catholic Church: Matthew, Luke, Mark, and John. Although they're not in that order, really, I think the theory of what they know, they think Mark is actually older than the other three. So Mark was written first, then Matthew and Luke, then later John was written later. And Matthew and Luke and Mark are more similar. They're often called the synoptic gospels because they're very similar. Although Mark doesn't go into the whole virgin birth story of Jesus and all that. They had other gospels too, but if you know about the Catholic, the church, early church, the Christian church got rid of the ones they thought weren't really canon, that were kind of illegitimate. They're often called the Apocrypha gospels. The New Testament, though, itself was not compiled until later. Now, most people don't know that, but it was compiled around the, I think that's a typo. That should be that's a wrong date. The way it was compiled in the 4th century. That should be early 4th century is when it actually was compiled, believe it or not. It's under the Emperor Constantine the Great, Constantine the First, actually compiled all the books into it originally. And so those are all the major parts that are part of it later. Besides the Gospels, you got the Acts, Epistles of Paul, 7 general epistles, and of course the book of Revelation. Are all in it, of course, later. So some people think the epistles of Paul were written first. That I don't know if you know that or not, because Paul started writing all these different churches, try to help them, inform them, and all that. Over time, Christianity split. It didn't stay together. You know about this. Even in the 1st century, it split, not later. And Christians started splitting into really two main groups. You had the Jewish Christians, which there are only really a few thousand people or more that were probably in it originally that started it, which was based on the Temple of Jerusalem. They're kind of part of it. It kind of broke away. And then you had the Roman Christians, or we call Gentile Christians, which were separate. Those were like pagans that basically converted to Christianity, more or less. By the way, I do have slides later if you want to look at it. I don't know if you've got more just little slides here on Jesus and all that. That's here, but I've already got stuff in there if you want to look at it later. But anyway, going back what I was saying, sorry about that. I'm going to get that to come up again for me. But they were different groups. Like in the Jewish Christians, there were actually two main groups. You had the Nazarenes. The Nazarenes were the original followers of Jesus. They were named after because Jesus from Nazareth. That's where it came from, the name. And over time, they had another leader they had named James the Just. He was like a brother or half brother of Jesus. He was kind of part of that group and kind of led them after. He was like one of their leaders. He was known as the Bishop of Jerusalem, they called him. Another group broke off called the Ebionites, which means in Greek, the poor ones. And they were a little different. They lived this life of like poverty, and thought that you didn't need material things and stuff like that. And they think both these groups may have survived up to like the early Middle Ages, but they became so different from the Roman Christians later that they were kind of seen as being heretical. They're heretics compared to the later religion. Then the Roman or Gentile Christians were heavily influenced by Paul, and I think in St. Paul and Peter, I think both those overall. And they began to kind of break away and all that. What split them apart? One thing was in 50 CE, they had the Council of Jerusalem met, where Paul, Peter, and James the Just all met. And they were talking about how the Gentiles were going to be, if they're going to be accepted into, Christianity with the Jewish Christians, that became a big conflict. because the Jewish Christians wanted them to follow Mosaic law, circumcision, things Jews do, and all of that. Paul rejected that. About that. He believed that Mosaic law was replaced by Jesus himself, like the Sermon on the Mount and all that. And so that became a major issue that split the two sects pretty much over time. Then Jews later don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah, and all that. That's eventually something that it's another thing that split them. Then the last thing, actually, there are two more things that split them apart too. There was also the Jewish-Roman wars that kind of helped dealt a blow too, as well. And what happened was the Second Temple was eventually destroyed by the Romans in the year 70, so-called First Jewish-Roman War, and so they got wiped out. And a lot of the leaders of the early Jewish Christians were often associated with the Temple period, and they were wiped out. So a lot of them were gone, and so the movement declined. And so after that, Christianity becomes more of a Roman religion. Oh, another thing too on the bottom there, I kind of added Fiscus Judaicus. That was another reason why a lot of the Jewish Christians declined, because they called it a Jewish tax. It was called, and the Romans put taxes on the Jews, but not on Christians. And so people didn't want to be Jewish because, you would get taxed. So that's part of why Judaism declined, which Judaism could have been a big religion in the Roman Empire, but that was one of the things that restricted it, more or less. So a lot of Jewish Christians were like, oh, I don't want to be associated with that group because I'll get taxed. Also, one more thing about Christianity, it later splits into two main churches, which everybody kind of knows about now. Those two medieval churches will be the Roman Catholic Church, of course, based in Italy. It was kind of a remnant of the Western Roman Empire, later led by the Pope, of course. And then, of course, the Greek Orthodox Church, or Orthodox Christianity, as they call it as well, will also form in the eastern part of the Roman Empire at Constantinople. And they're led by what they call a patriarch, who was the bishop of Constantinople. And the Pope was like the Bishop of Rome. So you have these two main bishops you had, and they become the religious leaders of these two churches. And pretty much Christianity stays split like this until the early modern times. And then if you know what happened, the Reformation happened because of Martin Luther, and you got the Protestants would break away from the Catholic Church. So that's your three main branches of Christianity that, exist later. All right, moving on. So that's pretty much, I'll be probably pretty much talking about Christianity off and on, throughout the Roman Empire, because it's basically underground after that, because it's not really seen as a legal religion. And so that leads to a lot of Christians being persecuted under different, emperors, more or less. Now, after the Julio-Claudian dynasty collapsed, they had what they call the Flavian dynasty that came in that reigned for not that long, about less than 30 years. And it was founded by this general named under Nero named Flavius Vespasian. He usually called Vespasian for short. And he seized power in the middle of a civil war. There was a civil war that lasted about a year and a half after Nero got killed among his generals declaring themselves emperor. And he would take over, and he would start a reign which would last about 10 years. He would reign from 69 to 79 CE. I do have an image of some of these emperors, of course, that reigned during this period. Let me see if I can find it, which is, where is it? Let's see. What I missed that. What happened to this thing here? I don't know what happened exactly, but something happened here. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just got a problem here with something going on here. I don't know what happened exactly. Oh, I'm sorry. I was trying to figure something out here. Anyway, hold on a second. There it is right there. Flavian dynasty, of course, emperors. You see Vespasian on the far left. You see the guy in the middle, of course, is Titus. And then you have Domitian. So you got these three emperors that you'll have that are part of the Flavian dynasty that are there overall. It's a very interesting dynasty, the Flavian dynasty overall. First of all, a little bit about it. Um, the It's the first dynasty where you've got a case where the sons actually succeed the father, which hadn't really happened yet at this point so far. There's not too many that actually do this. There's not too many father-son emperors that reign, so it's very rare. And the first two, which are Vespasian and Titus, were both Roman generals. Then Domitian, of course, was mostly like a governor administrator, not a general. And so he's got these two sons that reign, Titus and Domitian, overall. So it's kind of unique. Also, Vespasian is known for kind of restabilizing the empire. So it kind of helped to, continue the Pax Romana at that point because, the empire could have imploded, because of the civil war after Nero died. A little bit about Vespasian first. He was famous as a general fighting in that war I kind of told you a little bit about, called the First Jewish-Roman War, which was fought from about 66 to 73 AD or CE. What happened was the Jews revolted in Judea and also Galilee, and they wanted to kick the Romans out because the Jews wanted to kind of reform their like a state, like maybe another kingdom, like a kingdom of Israel again. And so the Romans sent armies in there, and at first they weren't successful. In fact, several legions that got wiped out. And so Vespasian had to go in there and subdue the actual revolt, sometimes called the Jewish Revolt or Great Jewish War. It's called all kinds of names. And there was a writer named Flavius Josephus. You've heard of Josephus, and he wrote about the wars. He was actually a Jewish general that fought in the war, and for some reason he ended up becoming friends with Vespasian after the war. And I think later Flavius Josephus, I don't know if you know about his story, he's actually seen as a traitor to the Jews. He kind of switched over to their side and all that. He wrote a book on the wars called The Jewish War. It's called. Now his son was famous too, Titus, if you know about it. After his father became emperor in the year, I think it was in 69, after the war was kind of going at that point, he would finish the war and he would go on to take the city of Jerusalem, sacking Jerusalem. And Titus is the one that actually destroys the second temple of Jerusalem. He destroys it except for, I think, what is left of it, which is the western or Wailing Wall that's supposedly still there. And the Romans later, under him and some other emperors, would force all the Jews to leave Israel. They'd kick them out and disperse them all throughout the Mediterranean Sea. This became known as the Great Diaspora, where they're forced to leave. And that's how a lot of Jews later end up in Europe, like in different parts of Europe, like especially like in parts of Germany and Poland and the Ukraine and all that. That's how they get there because they eventually spread all over the place. I think there's one theory that they spread first to like the Rhineland and then they spread eastward all the way to Poland and the Ukraine at one point. Vespasian, if you know about it, is very famous for building most of the Roman Colosseum, which of course is probably the most famous building ever erected in Rome. And was believed to have been constructed, by the way, by Jewish slaves. Good, yeah, they think that's true because this happened right after they had sacked Jerusalem and all this. So I think maybe up to 60,000 of them actually helped build it over about like maybe a 10-year period because it was, I think, opened in the year 81 CE or AD. Oh, also they built the Arch of Titus, which honored Titus, like his military victories, sacking Jerusalem and all that. The Colosseum, that's not the name it was called originally. The original name it was called was the Amphitheatrum Flavianum. But what happened was they believe it was constructed on this artificial lake that was part of a palace complex of Emperor Nero. And Nero had this statue nearby. It was a huge statue of him that was called the Colossal of Nero. And so they started calling it Colosseum. after the actual statue. And they believe under Emperor Titus is when the first games opened, by the way, which was in the year 81. Like I said, that's the amount of people that actually can seat in it, maybe 50 to 60,000. And it's not really the actual building, like you look at the inside of it and all that, it's not really a round shape. It's more of an oval shape, which I think a lot of stadiums are kind of built that way. And so the Coliseum is kind of like a prototype stadium, to like stadiums we have today, like for football and soccer, I guess, as well. Yeah, it's like 640 feet long by 528 feet wide. So you can see it's an oval shape to it. Height is about 165 feet, they think. They think it had some kind of retractable roof on it, like you see on some of these stadiums where they can open it up. They have that supposedly on this stadium. Also, you'll notice an area down here. It's called the Hypogeum, which is down here. That was an area that was kind of below the playing field where they might store animals that they might use in events, gladiators and POWs, probably in cages and stuff like that, to be later used, in different events that would be put on, more or less. Now, what else? What kind of events were put on? Well, there's all kinds of things. I know in the morning times, they would sometimes put on like wild beast hunts, where you'd have people go in there and they'd kill animals, and they would bring animals from all over the empire, exotic animals like giraffes and elephants and things like that. And people would go in there and, like I said, kill them. Gladiatorial events were usually the marquee events, which they weren't always to the death. Not always, but there's some speculation that they may have been to the death. That's something they didn't really talk much about, a lot of the historians. There's one story where I think they talk about that, but it's kind of rare. So it's not like you think in Hollywood where they always fight to the death necessarily. Yeah, they think they may have had mock naval battles where they would fill the whole thing with water, believe it or not. And they think they've actually proven that, because they had some kind of aqueduct that fed water to it at one point. Yeah, executions. They would do that too, where they'd bring people in and execute people, enemies of the state, stuff like Christians and other groups. They put on plays as well. So they put on a play, and how somebody die in the play? They really died. Crazy. But anyway, the Romans had the Circus Maximus, which they talked about in the video as well. That's, of course, a famous racetrack, of course, in Rome, and it was used mostly for chariot racing and maybe putting on other events. And yeah, it could seat up to 250,000 people, which is huge. And chariot racing was real big, like in the Greek and Roman world. And like at Constantinople, they had the Hippodrome, which is kind of a smaller version of it that they had as well. Now, Vespasian and the other two guys, they believe they all died of natural causes. So Vespasian died. Titus came in, and he reigned about a little bit over 2 years, about 26 months, from about 79 to 81. He was actually pretty popular, by the way, Titus. I guess he was a war hero, all of that. What he's mostly known for, Titus, was a natural catastrophe that happened under his reign, which is if you know about it, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius that they think erupted in August of 79. Maybe the date of August 24th is believed to be the date of when it happened. I think I've got a picture showing Mount Vesuvius erupting. Last time it erupted was in World War II, when the Allies were fighting the Axis powers, mostly Germany, in the war. It actually blew up again, but it's not as bad as the one that happened in 79 CE. And it ended up destroying, by the way, multiple cities and towns that were around Naples, which was in southern Italy, on the west coast of Italy. And the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, by the way, is considered, by the way, one of the worst volcanic eruptions in history. They think that the equivalency of the amount of eruption that came out of the volcano was the equivalent of 100,000 more times powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. That's how powerful it was. And of course, it rained like ash and debris, probably lava, basically where some of those cities were. The two main cities that were destroyed, one was called Herculaneum. It was buried, and so was Pompeii. It was also buried as well. And that's the amount of people they think were killed. May have been more than that. They think somewhere between 15 and 20,000 people were killed. Of course, a lot of people were refugees afterwards. And Titus actually was kind of popular because he helped a lot of the refugees afterwards. And there was a writer and poet, he was also, I think, a government official named Pliny the Younger. He actually wrote about it, like in like a letter describing the actual volcanic eruption. He was actually the first to do this. And he wrote the information and gave it to Tacitus, the famous Roman historian. So Tacitus, they talked about it too. So that it definitely happened. And of course, it buried Pompeii. And of course, if you know about Pompeii, it's now, like the old Pompeii is mostly ruins. So you can see that there with the mountain in the back, the volcano in the background. And it is interesting because it did kind of preserve a lot of parts of the city. Even some of the different buildings were preserved. Like they found artwork in some of the homes and buildings still intact, and all of that. So there's the amphitheater that they actually kind of buried at one point with ash and all that. And that's a very famous event that really happened under him with the Flavians. Also, one more, of course, I'll talk about with them. Of course, you had Titus' brother, Domitian. He came in too. He was a tyrannical ruler, Domitian, and he reigned the longest, 15 years, roughly. Was actually a pretty good emperor. He was actually a pretty good administrator, kind of like Claudius was. He was known for a lot of reconstruction projects. Like he built like close to around 50 buildings in Rome, things like that. But he was very ruthless. There was kind of like this cult of personality behind his whole reign and all that. And he began persecuting a lot of different groups. He actually eliminated some of the senators, got rid of some of them, had them killed off or imprisoned under him. He also persecuted Christians and Jews a lot. So him and Nero, I think, were considered the two worst emperors that persecuted Christians and all that. And he also censored a lot of writings, like a lot of the writings of like early Christianity. That's why some of it is missing because of him. So yeah, a lot of them burned and stuff like that. But Domitian was eventually killed. He was assassinated in 96 CE in some kind of conspiracy involving the Senate and the Praetorian Guard. And so what's going to happen next is that his assassination is going to bring on a new period that I'll get to later. It's called the Five Good Emperors. That'll come in, which is mostly around the early to mid 2nd century. It's considered the peak of the Pax Romana. So I'll get to that in a second. About that a little later. Now, let me go ahead and review a little bit what we've covered so far right now. I don't think we've done any review, so I need to kind of do that today as well. What does Octavian do after consolidating sole power over Rome? What name is he called afterwards? Octavian, of course, became the first emperor of the Roman Empire. He was known as Augustus, is what the Roman Senate called him. Was his title? He preferred as an emperor. He preferred Princeps Civitas, or just Princeps, which meant first citizen. What was the age of Augustus? What area of Roman peace begins under his reign? The age of Augustus was the nickname for like his reign, which was like around 41 years. It was considered a golden age of the early Roman Empire. And he started the so-called Pax Romana, the period of Roman peace, which would last around 200 years, from about 27 BC to about 180 CE or AD. So it's considered like the peak golden age of the whole empire, which mostly happens in the 1st, 2nd centuries CE. Who are some historians that wrote about the early emperors of Rome? I told you Suetonius, the 12 Caesars. You have Tacitus, who wrote the Annals or Histories of Rome. And I've told you about Dio Cassius, or Cassius Dio, who wrote Roman history. It was an extensive book. What was the Praetorian Guard? It was a the bodyguards or the imperial bodyguards of the Roman empire that protected the emperors. They were about the size of a legion. It was created by Octavian or Augustus. What dynasty was founded by Augustus? Augustus, of course, founded the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The emperors in it, of course, were Augustus, who was actually Octavian, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. Who were they famous for? Tiberius was a tyrannical ruler, an ex-general under Augustus. He was adopted by him. It's under him that Christianity begins. And he was the one that was known for tyrannical, like treason trials, like a period of political repression. Caligula was his nephew. He was known as Little Boots. He was known for being kind of insane, mad, sadistic kind of ruler. He was called Little Boots, and of course, told you that he was one of the first emperors to be assassinated. Claudius, or Claudius I, was his uncle. He reigned and afterwards as the fourth one. And Claudius was known for his beginning the conquest of Britain. That's one of the things he's known for. He's also the first emperor born like in outside Italy from Gaul. And he was also, of course, they think maybe possibly murdered as well by his wife, Agrippina the Younger. Nero was his grandnephew, who was the last Julio-Claudian emperor. Nero is also kind of known for the same kind of antics as Caligula and Tiberius. So he's a tyrannical ruler that reigned from the age of 16. Nero is famous for killing his mother, but he was more known for the Great Fire of Rome and his persecution of Christians. Jesus of Nazareth was seen as the founder or figure that they think is the basis of the Christian religion, Christianity, who was seen as the Son of God and a Messiah. They think Jesus was some kind of preacher or Jewish rabbi that lived in northern Israel. What governor of Judea put him to death? That was Pontius Pilate, of course, who was a prefect under, they think, Emperor Tiberius. What was the apostolic age? The apostolic age is where the apostles of Jesus, his main disciples, spread Christianity throughout the whole empire. Who are some famous apostles of Jesus? St. Peter, also called Simon Peter. Told you about St. John the Baptist. St. James the Greater was another one that was famous. And then they also had Paul, but Paul wasn't really associated with Jesus. Why was Paul of Tarsus important to early Christianity, or St. Paul? Paul was important because he was the main apostle, first century, that began to spread Christianity to non-Jews, like Gentiles, like Roman Christians. And so he was known as later the apostle to the Gentiles. What are the four gospel accounts in the New Testament? Matthew, Luke, Mark, and John. What two main Christian sects emerged in the first century BC? You had the Jewish Christians, was the original sect, like the Nazarenes especially. They also had the Ebionites. And you also had the Roman Christians, who were like what they call Gentiles, non-Jews. There were different causes of why it split apart. I told you that. It was caused by the Council of Jerusalem, 50 CE. That was one thing that split it apart. They also had the first Jewish-Roman War, which destroyed the Temple of Jerusalem, because all the leaders of the original Jewish Christians died off. A lot of them did. I also told you about the Jewish tax. A lot of Christians didn't want to be Jewish because they didn't want to get taxed. And then, of course, you had also the Middle Ages. They split into two rival churches, I told you, which is the Catholic Church in Italy, and then you had the Orthodox Church in Greece, Turkey, where the Constantinople is. It's also called Greek Orthodox, the Orthodox Church. Who took over and founded the Flavian dynasty? That, of course, was Vespasian, who was a Roman general under Nero. He took over after a civil war broke out. What famous war broke out in 66 AD under Emperor Nero in the region of Judea, Israel? That was, of course, the first Jewish-Roman war, which has all kinds of names. The Jewish Revolt or Great Jewish Revolt or War, it's chronicled by Josephus, the Jewish Roman writer. What were the two generals that put it down? Well, Vespasian was the first general sent there to successfully put it down. And then his son, Titus, was the one that sacked the city of Jerusalem, including the temple of Jerusalem. What famous building did Vespasian build? He, of course, constructed the Colosseum in Rome. Still stands there today. His son, of course, is the one that opened it, Titus. What was Emperor Titus known for? He was known for being the first emperor to succeed his father. And he was a former Roman general that was only on the throne for like 26 months. It was a very short reign, but he was very popular. He was more known for the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE that destroyed cities like Pompeii and Herculaneum. His brother reigned too, the last Flavian ruler, and his name was Domitian. Domitian, of course, was a very tyrannical ruler, even though he's a good administrator. And he was later overthrown in a conspiracy involving, like I said, the Senate and, of course, the Praetorian Guard. Time is at 1:02, not much left. So a little bit, I guess I could talk a few minutes, not much. Now, what's going to happen next, like I said, is a new emperors are going to come in after that, which is they have the period of the 5 good emperors that they have, which goes from 96 to 180 or 180 CE, basically. Like I said, this was a golden age and peak of the Pax Romana when it was really at its best. It was also like the zenith of the Roman Empire. What I mean by that is that the size of the empire peaked. Like I think under that period, like in the 2nd century, maybe about 117, they think it is, the empire peaked at a size of about 2 million square miles or more. And it stretched from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to Iraq. It was huge at one point. Those are the 5 emperors that were part of it. There were so-called 5 good emperors, which were Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and then they have Marcus Aurelius. And why do they call them the 5 good emperors? They call them that because it was a nickname that Machiavelli came up with. You may have heard of him. He was an Italian diplomat and writer who wrote the book called The Prince. It was written in the 1500s. He coined that term. He started calling them 5 good emperors, and so it stuck after that. And so later historians, of course, dubbed them that. And I could talk about at least one of them for now because I'm running out of time here, I know, for today, because I don't want to go too long on my lectures. But the first one I'll give you at least is Marcus Nerva. He was the one that started it. In the first, if you know about this period, it's actually 2 dynasties. You have the Nerva dynasty, and you have the Antonine dynasty. The Nerva dynasty has 3 rulers in it: Nerva, Trajan, and Hadrian. And Nerva was actually a Roman senator who had been an advisor to Domitian. He was very close with Domitian. And when Domitian was killed, the Senate decided to appoint him as the emperor, which doesn't happen very often when the Senate does this, because usually the military is behind it more than anything. And so that's how he got in power. He reigned for only like 2 years or so and died of like a natural cause, like a stroke or something like that. And he would end up putting a general on the throne named Emperor Trajan, who I'll get into later. And he starts a tradition, which is famous with this period, where what they do is they adopt somebody as the successor. So they didn't want like maybe the son coming in and he's crazy like Domitian, that kind of thing. So they want to put in a proper successor who's maybe got a lot of experience and he's a good leader. And so he adopted Marcus Trajan as a Roman general. And so a lot of the emperors of this period of the 5 good emperors are often called the adoptive emperors, is what they'll be called. So I think that's it for today. I'm going to stop here for now in this lecture because I didn't want to, like I said, go too far today. because I don't want my lectures to be too long, over an hour too much. But did want to remind you about completing the assignments, of course, this week. So I told you I got those 2 quizzes, of course, that are up right now to do. Don't forget your book reports due this week, so start turning it into the speed grader to me. Then don't forget later, I think by Friday, you've got the vocab due also as well. So I will have this lecture up to my YouTube channel a little bit later. So if you got any comments, questions, let me know. But on Wednesday, I'm going to try to continue talking about the Roman. I think it's going to take maybe another lecture, maybe part of another lecture to try to finish this period. But eventually I'll get to it because it's taken a while because we had to talk about Christianity and all that, which is another side story. So that's it for today. I hope y'all are doing okay out there, and hope y'all have a good week as well. So y'all take care and have a great afternoon. Okay? See you later.